I want to begin by saying that it's just wonderful to be here at NATE and here in this beautiful city, which I admire very much. And it's especially good to be here with all of you, leaders who are energized to address what I think are some of the most pressing issues of our time when it comes to learning and employment. I also want to say I'm honored to be at this year's conference, not only because of the import of these issues, but also as an American, I want to recognize the fact that this is actually the Canadian sesquicentennial. And I'm a regular visitor to Canada, a great nation in so many ways. And I want to say, in all sincerity, that celebrating the milestone of successful democracies is something that we should never get tired of. As an American, we're thinking about that a lot these days. And I'm honored by the company in which I find myself as a visitor during this momentous year. President Obama is actually going to be in Montreal in a few days. Prince Charles will be in Ottawa soon thereafter. So you can say, and Marisotis was in Edmonton. So all of those things have happened during the sesquicentennial. What I love about celebrating these milestones, though, is that they can be used as occasions to take stock and focus on creative ways to improve the status quo, not unlike what we're doing right here at this conference. In my view, this conference gives us an opportunity to challenge what is and work on what can be, to fix a problem and talk about ways, big and small, that we can develop and deploy the talent that employers need to fill the jobs that workers actually want. And when Nabina asked me to speak here today on those very issues, she urged me to talk about the urgent need for Canada, like the US, to actually develop and deploy its talent pool. Now, I want to be clear up front that I'm not here to tell you about the great American model. I've spent much of my career admiring what Canada has done to prepare its citizens for work and for life through a variety of learning institutions, and I'm especially impressed with what all of you do in the colleges and institutes that make up the public polytechnic sector. We have a great deal to learn from the polytechnics model in the US. But talent development and deployment is something I think both countries need to learn more about and act upon, given what I see as a rapidly rising demand for talent. That's one reason why I wrote this book called America Needs Talent. Now, I've had the great fortune of writing a commercially successful book, and so I've talked about it at over 100 venues across the US and in several other countries over the last year or so. To be honest, today I'm not going to get into a lot of the detail about the book itself. We can certainly cover some of my thoughts on things like creating urban-based talent hubs or any of the other big ideas I tried to advance in the book when we get to the Q&A section after my remarks. Instead, I didn't want to miss this opportunity to be with all of you to talk specifically about why talent development and deployment is so important right now to Canada and the US, and how post-secondary learning needs to play a central role in that process. Now, I know a lot of our pop culture will tell us that America's got talent and Canada's got talent. And, TV shows are great, to be sure. But for reasons I'll explain in a moment, preparing for my visit with you today actually gave me an opportunity to think about what I had actually written in the book. And after a lot of thought, I sort of wish I had called the book North America Needs Talent. You see, I know that our countries are different in many ways, including our respective post-secondary learning systems, but they also share many similarities. And our need for talent is clearly one of them. Simply put, the economies of our nations cannot thrive if the workforce is not sufficiently skilled to fill the jobs of today and tomorrow. And labor market experts are all but unanimous in saying that a high school diploma simply can't convey those skills adequately. Credentials, degrees, certificates, industry certifications, and other valuable credentials are the currency of the realm in conveying to employers that our workforce has the right skills, abilities, and knowledge. Consider this simple fact from the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce about the US experience. They found that of the 11.6 million American jobs created since the end of the Great Recession in 2010, 11.5 5 million of those 11.6 million new jobs created went to workers who had at least some post-high school education and training. Let me repeat that. 11.5 million of the 11.6 million new jobs, 99% in the post-recession economy in the US, required post-secondary education. Data from the OECD show that in Canada, adults with tertiary education experience have unemployment rates that are less than 1/2 of those with secondary or less than secondary education or training. These employment data play out obviously in different ways, depending on the province you're in, of course, but the overall trend is clear. In Canada, more than 70% of the top-paying jobs are in fields like healthcare, financial services, logistics, and production management, and other fields that require post-high school credentials, ranging from apprentice and certificate programs to postgraduate credentials. Our friends in Mexico have seen similar trends, making this truly a North American talent imperative. Now, evidence of how this plays out, I think, is really everywhere. Look at the compensation data, the increasing wages that employers are willing to pay for people with talent to do the jobs that are increasingly in demand in the global knowledge economy. Look at the social data, showing why people with talent perform better as citizens and community leaders when they actually have higher levels of developed talent. Talent is clearly the key to our shared success in the modern world. So sure, maybe Canada's got talent, but not enough of it and not the right kind for today's world. Of course, a television show's definition of talent is a little bit different than what I'm talking about. That's got a lot to do with singing and dancing. Certainly one element of what we might call talent, to be sure, and no doubt a kind of talent that some of you have enjoyed, or from my vantage point, endured, depending on the participant. But to me, talent is much more than a single ability or skill. It's a reflection of the synergies that result when an individual acquires a mix of capabilities that lead to prosperity in his or her career and personal life. It's what happens when you take knowledge, skills, abilities, values, interests, and personality traits and hone them through things like education, training, or experience in ways that not only impact that individual, but impact all of us as a society. To break that down a bit, talent to me includes knowledge of particular subject matter, skills like critical thinking that enable an individual to use his or her knowledge to solve problems, abilities like memory, creativity, and reasoning, values including achievement and authority, interests that dictate the environment where a person prefers to locate, and personality traits or patterns of behavior, thought, or emotion. Now, the good news is that most of the world knows that Canadians are actually doing a pretty darn good job of developing talent, at least if we measure that achievement by looking at rates of educational attainment. As you undoubtedly know, Canada ranks first in adult attainment and post-secondary credentials among countries ranked by the OECD. Now, from the US perspective, we at Lumina Foundation have committed ourselves to an ambitious national educational attainment goal to try to get us to where you are. By 2025, we want 60% of Americans to have a high-quality post-secondary credential, a degree, certificate, or other credential that prepares them to earn a spot in the middle class. When we set this goal in 2008, our attainment rate was about 38% in the United States. Today, we're at almost about 46%. And one of the key reasons, besides the fact that you've got one of the largest private foundations in the US, and Lumina Foundation helping to drive that goal, is that 40 states have now adopted the concept of setting a post-secondary attainment goal for their states. And working with us and many others, they're actually developing strategies and public policies to create the change that's necessary through funding methods, through changes in delivery models and learning, and a variety of other efforts that actually will help get to that goal. Now, if you apply that American benchmark that I mentioned a moment ago, 60% here in Canada, as I said, I think you're already there, or maybe you're nearly there. I'm equivocating a little bit because there's varying statistics. You can always find a statistic to support your argument, right? So the National Household Survey found that 64% of adults had post-secondary qualifications, while the OECD has a more restrictive definition, placing the number at about 52%. So it's tough to say for sure. I think it's likely that the difference is in what credentials exactly are included in the count and whether or not those credentials are measured as being high quality, which I'll come back to in a moment. But even at this lower 52% number of OECD, Canada's attainment exceeds that of nearly every country on the planet. Our attainment rate in the US, as I said, measured by both degrees and certificates, because that's the data that we have right now, is just under 46%. So clearly you're doing something right. Canada recognizes, I think, the great value of and demand for technical and technological credentials better than virtually any other country in the world. And frankly, I know this is a fact because I've studied your model in my work in the US and in work that I've done earlier in my career working in places like South Africa, where the Polytechnics model thrived for decades. Your institutions succeed because the learning offerings regularly shift based on employers' needs and because your overarching goal is to actually educate individuals for employment. I consider this to be a huge positive, and I commend you because I know this has not been without considerable strife to be able to get there. We at Lumina recognize that every nation's economy needs an array of workers and an array of talent that's articulated as knowledge, skills, and abilities. And these skills, abilities, and knowledge must be developed by an array of high-quality programs and experiences represented further by an array of credentials. Only with that array of credentials do we North Americans have the chance to meet our goals for post-secondary attainment. Now, since 2014, we at Lumina Foundation have been counting high-quality certificates and other credentials besides degrees in the US towards the 60% American goal because we see non-degree credentials as one of the keys to the middle class for many workers. Lumina Foundation actually had to collect these data independent of government in order to bring them to light nationally, because the statement that I just made about non-degree credentials is probably not as universally recognized as it should be by our national government. Now, I understand that some in Canada, like in the US, may consider technical or vocational programs to be a second-tier education, something less than a university degree. As you well know, there are some who say that Canada needs more degreed individuals, particularly those with PhDs. Now, whether that's a cause for concern or whether this means that Canada does a better job of meeting the diverse needs of employers is a question, frankly, that I'm going to leave to you and your university counterparts, indeed, for the entire country to sort out. Don't let an American get in the way of your conversation there. But allow me to say that you've got some great opportunities to build on what you've already accomplished, no matter what. First, you'll be assisted in that decision-making process by information you glean from the ever-evolving job market. For example, what credentials are required for jobs that attract too few applicants? On the other hand, what credentials are held by applicants who can't actually find jobs? Do the data substantiate or conflict with the call for things like more university degrees? And because the job market is ever-evolving, your answer today may be different than your answer tomorrow. Second, Canada's well-conceived immigration policy, which differs markedly from that in the US, helps the country lure in demand talent to its borders. For a number of years, the US's dysfunctional, hard-to-navigate immigration system has frankly prevented talented foreign-born workers from making the United States their home. If you can believe it, the US Congress has actually failed for 27 years to fix the system. 27 years along, I had hair 27 years ago. We've had Republican and Democratic presidents and Republican and Democratic Congresses over that time, as well as periods of total government control by one party and periods of split control, and yet our government has not been able to get it done. What's more, you all know that the presidential campaign of 2016 laid bare the fact that many of my fellow citizens seem to have forgotten that ours is a nation built by immigrants. And given the outcome of the election, even those would-be immigrants who've not been banned outright likely question whether a move to the United States is now such a wise idea. Part of the problem, back to the facts, has been that the immigration system in my country is largely based on reuniting families. Think about it. Data from the most recent fiscal year show that green cards were provided to 226,000 members of extended families, compared to only about 140,000 people who were coming to fill jobs. Now that's a humane policy, to be sure, and something that we should be proud of. But unlike the system here, which prioritizes immigrants who possess in-demand skills or who already have a job in place, our approach does not help us to solve our need for talent. As the New York Times recently noted, the number of international students who come to Canada to study surged 92% from 2008 to 2015. That influx, encouraged by an affordable set of post-secondary learning offerings and a path to citizenship, is a smart way to develop the talent that this nation needs. Third, this question is sort of the opposite of we in the United States are asking. Instead, I think we are more focused on the idea that fundamentally our system of post-secondary learning is broken. An education-oriented publication which Lumina Foundation supports, called the Hechinger Report, recently asked if university degrees were outdated. The article said that, quote, even as degrees from associates to doctorates proliferate, they are joined, maybe trumped, that's their word, not mine, by thousands of resume-worthy credentials from shorter non-degree programs. Now those resume-worthy credentials, quote unquote, have been a focus of Lumina's work for several years. We recognize that talent can be developed in settings other than a degree-granting university, but not all educational programs are created equal, nor are all of the credentials. Now, I'm not talking about this issue of college credentials versus university degrees. As I've already said, I see a path for both. No, I'm talking about the quality of the individual programs. I'm talking about closer alignment between what the educators produce and what the employers say they actually need. I'm talking about a system that serves the learner, whether that learner is a teenager straight out of high school or an adult who has to update his or her skills to remain employable. And I'm talking about finding ways to assure an employer that a certificate or a badge or a degree has meaning, that the applicant seeking the position has the skill implied by the credential and desired by the employer. As I mentioned, Lumina's been working on these issues, and I'd like to talk about a couple of different approaches that we find promising for the future of post-secondary learning and for meeting our talent needs. One is one that many of you know about, and that's competency-based learning. This concept values all high-quality learning wherever it's achieved. That might be in a formal course that's taught in a classroom or online, or it might be on the job, or even in a volunteer position with a community organization. The goal of the learning experience, wherever or however it takes place, is to achieve specific learning outcomes. The learner must move through the experience at his or her own pace. Once he or she has mastered the skill or competency and proven that mastery, the learner can then move on to another competency. To prove mastery of the competency, the learner can take a test, can compile a portfolio, can participate in a simulation, or be observed by the instructor in a work environment. We hear from learners, especially adults who've spent time in the workplace, that competency-based learning actually validates them. Think about it. For many adult learners, it has to be deeply frustrating, perhaps even demeaning, to be someone who's been in the workplace for years, has learned a thing or two, and is actually savvy enough to be seeking a new credential to update his or her skills and prepare for a new position. Yet often this person is treated as if he or she knows nothing, brings nothing to the table. That's the traditional model. Competency-based learning changes all of that. We've also heard from employers who often are challenged by resumes with inexact or varying labels for applicant skills and classroom grades that can be interpreted in any number of ways. They want to be able to trust what a credential actually means, and having that credential based on competency-based learning is certainly one way of doing that. We at Lumina actually think that the entire post-secondary learning system needs to focus increasingly on competency. We know that it's beneficial to everyone. Now, even institutions that use the traditional credit hour-based model to award its degrees or certificates can adapt their offerings to focus on competencies. In fact, many of those institutions, like Southern New Hampshire University, are the leaders in competency-based learning in the US. A growing number of institutions have adopted full and comprehensive competency-based programs. To assure that those programs, however, are of high quality, the Competency-Based Education Network recently issued quality standards. Now that network, which we call CBEN, comprises 30 American colleges and universities and 4 public systems with 82 campuses across the US. CBEN spent the past year researching and developing those standards, which can apply to all comprehensive competency-based programs regardless of the model used. We'd also like to see institutions of higher learning recognize the learner's credentials and give credit for them when the learner seeks a higher level credential or a degree. Paving a smoother pathway between, say, a certificate and a 2-year diploma, or a 2-year diploma and a bachelor's degree would encourage learners to seek higher learning. So the second approach that I want to mention related to these critical matters of post-secondary learning is to adopt across the entire spectrum of credential granting organizations transparent and common language so that everyone, prospective learner, institution, employer, understands what a particular credential actually means. Just as an employer may have difficulty relying on a course grade or GPA to determine whether an applicant is qualified for a particular job, so may the employer find it difficult to decipher the actual meaning behind the credential. At Lumina, we're supporting an effort to create that transparency through a new organization called Credential Engine. One centerpiece project of Credential Engine is an online registry for all types of learning credentials. Right now, the registry is in its formative stage, what we're calling the sandbox mode. Together in that web-based sandbox, more than 100 different credential issuers, from community colleges and universities to workforce-based organizations, industry certification bodies, and labor unions, are now entering information about the credentials that they offer. As someone at one of these organizations enters information, he or she is actually walked through the process using common credential transparency descriptor language. That is, vocabulary that describes key features of the credential and the credentialing organization and other information that enables the end user to determine the quality, value, and applicability of the credential. We actually call this CTDL, like HTML, and it is a real thing. It is a descriptive language that's been developed by leading technology experts. Now, the registry isn't yet open to the public, but likely will be as a test site by late this fall. It will not be limited just to American institutions. Ultimately, the goal is to include degrees, certificates, certifications, apprenticeships, licenses, badges, and more, all types of credentials offered by universities, colleges, schools, industry and professional organizations, certification organizations, labor unions, employers, and even military organizations around the world. All of these various credentials will be described by common language and displayed in a searchable format on the online registry. What we're anticipating is that in the coming years, developers will create apps that are tailor-made for different users, for employers, for learners, for credentialing organizations, much like Travelocity or Orbitz or Expedia are used in the travel industry. In the credentials arena, we would expect apps for all of those different categories of people I mentioned, even for people like the career counselors or the people working in workforce boards and agencies, as well as those in traditional learning contexts like schools, colleges, and universities. There's actually a first prototype app for the credential registry called Workit. It enables the registry participants who are testing the system to see how their information will be presented. Eventually, Workit will enable any user to search the registry. So stay tuned as the kinks are worked out, the registry is brought to scale, and apps are developed. I think the prototype is promising, and I'm optimistic that Credential Engine will bring a new and much-needed level of transparency to post-secondary learning. Now, before I wrap up and take your questions, let me add just one more quick thought that I'd like you to ponder at this conference and really beyond. As your institutions hone your programs and consider the solutions that I've mentioned today, keep in mind that all countries, even those like Canada that enjoy a relatively high rate of post-secondary attainment, must continually ask the question, who's being left out or left behind in this learning revolution? It's a question for all of us to not just think about, but to actually act upon. After all, the very best way to measure the success of a nation, perhaps perhaps even one's basic worth as an individual, is to focus on how we serve those who need us most, those who are most vulnerable. This is especially true for racial and ethnic minorities and other underserved populations. For success to be complete, for it to be lasting and real, it must be shared equitably. So I thank you for working to create that shared success among your students and for your good work to help bring learning and employment together in ways that impact all Canadians, economically and socially. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm bursting with questions to ask you, but I will tell everyone here, we are privileged to have Jamie through till 10 o'clock and books to sign. The book is called America Needs Talent, and Jamie has donated a number of books for each of you to have, and they'll all be at the South Lobby at 10 o'clock. So for the next half an hour, I'd like to have a conversation with Jamie. It's rare to have this kind of ability to talk about things, and I'll lead off with a couple of different topics that we haven't heard from you this morning, while people who are the educators in the room would all have lots to talk to you about competency-based learning. I'm going to talk about two other themes that I can't resist having you here and raising. One, in your book, America Needs Talent, you talked about cities as urban hubs of talent, and I know that that's on your mind. Every one of our leading polytechnics are actually in large urban areas, growth areas of population in this country. And there seems to me to be quite a connection between the focus now on needing smart cities and the hubs of talent. And maybe you could share some thoughts about that. And then I'll go back to more of an organizational question.
Sure. Thank you. And I really am looking forward to your question. Having done this so many times, trust me, there is no question I won't try to answer. I don't know if I'll give you a good answer, but there is no question I won't try to answer. Yeah, you know, this idea of seeing cities as talent hubs has been part of the evolution of my thinking over 3 decades about how we think about talent development and deployment. And as an urban resident of several different cities over the course of my career, I've always been troubled by the fact that cities are often seen as problems, as challenges, as places where you've got to go to solve things. My view is that cities are quite the opposite. I've bought into the Richard Florida idea a long idea ago, right? Which is that these are places where talent and creativity thrive and where the combination of diverse peoples coming together can actually produce a high quality of life, not only for the people in those cities, but indeed for the surrounding areas and often for the states, the provinces, and the other communities that they serve. So to me, this idea of rethinking our approach to urban development at its core has to do with this idea that cities should be seen as hubs of talent, places where all of these things come together in a way that creates talented communities and therefore thriving cities and communities. And there are different places in the US context that we've looked at where you can see it. Now everybody in Canada, by the way, points to Toronto as the example of that. We can debate that one, about whether or not Toronto fits the talent hub model. But there are interesting examples in the US of places that you may not have thought a lot about because they tend not to be the big cities. Places like Santa Ana, California, or even Buffalo, New York. You know, nobody's going to Buffalo for the weather. They're going to Buffalo because they recognize the opportunity of a vibrant, dynamic community. Buffalo is a draw right now because they've invested in talent development and deployment in ways that are really quite impressive, and it's paying off. So lots of communities that are getting from where they were to where they've been, where they are investing in this idea of collaborative strategies for talent development and deployment, are succeeding. And those collaborative strategies mean that you bring business and industry together with civic leaders, educational leaders, and NGOs, and you actually set goals for talent development and deployment in those communities. And then you work collaboratively. You try to be as harmonious as you can, but sometimes you're going to beat each other up because you don't agree, but you stay focused on the goal. And to the point that I made earlier about these post-secondary attainment goals, talent goals are very important for these communities. It's extremely important to sit down and say, here's where we are, here's where we need to be based on the projections for our labor market, for our social sector, et cetera, and here's what we need to do collaboratively in order to be able to get there. And you stick with the goal, even if some of the strategies fail, you stay focused on the goal and actually get there. And more communities that we're seeing in the US are actually getting there by making talent the focus, the hub of what they're trying to accomplish as cities.
Let me see if there. Do I have other questions coming along?
Yeah, fire away.
Fire away.
I'm one of the few who aren't. Is it working now? Okay. I'm one of the few not with the Polytechnic. I'm actually with Suncor on a panel later. But I love this sort of drive-by you did on creativity. So I'd like to know more of your thoughts on, I call it the paradox of trying to teach creativity.
Yeah, so to me, it is extremely complicated. When we talk about what makes you successful in the modern world, right? So an employer like you will say that we tend to value more people who have broad, generalizable knowledge and skills, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, communication, all those things, which are difficult to teach as discrete topics. What tends to happen, though, is that those things emerge in these delivery models where you're actually pushing more for the competency, right? So you can actually, in the context of learning English or chemical engineering or graphic design, actually embed these concepts of creativity and critical thinking and problem solving in the curriculum of those programs. And we see more and more evidence of how that actually works. So it's not a distinct topic. You don't take the class in creativity. You learn the concepts of creativity across a whole array of different learning modules and courses in ways that can actually make a real difference. Your question gives me a chance to riff on one of my favorite topics. So I'm going to go off a little bit on another issue because I've started writing. I'm not sure I'm writing another book yet, so I'm writing and I'm not sure where it's going yet. But I've started writing about, as a sort of successor to these ideas about talent, a sort of bigger question, which is the simple way to describe it is, what are the humans going to do in the robot era? And I think that question is really profound when it relates to what you just asked, because I think as humans we're going to increasingly be called upon and relied upon to do the things where human interaction, where creativity, where our ability to actually relate to one another as people is going to be increasingly valued. And how that plays out in our post-secondary learning institutions, I think, is going to be incredibly important. I am terribly worried about the dynamic that we all know about and that we've read about in terms of the labor market data. I think it's real. I think that the disruptive nature of technology and how it is going to change work is something that we haven't fully grasped. If you look at the American data on truck driving, and many of you know the truck driving story because it's a huge job in Canada. So in the US, truck driver is the #1 job in 30 of the 50 US states. Right now, we have a shortage of truck drivers in the United States of about 150,000. So every truck that you drive by has a sign on it that says, drive for us, we pay well, great benefits, blah, blah, blah. By 2025, we're estimating that 3.7 million truck driving jobs will be eliminated because of automation and artificial intelligence. Not just because of self-driving vehicles, but also because of the efficiency that we're getting with the automation and the AI processes that we're using in the transportation industry. We have no answer for what to do for those 3.7 million individuals right now, none. We have no strategy, no plan, and my view is we've got to think hard about preparing those individuals for the next economy. And I'm not sure it's, sort of managing transportation systems that are automation and AI driven, right? I think we've got to think hard about preparing those individuals for work in fields like healthcare and other areas where the human element of work is going to be increasingly important.
Well, I'll pick up on that and say, well, those displaced truck drivers, do they have to go back and get a degree, or can you now talk a little bit about the stackable credentials?
Yeah,
a little bit about that.
I think it's hard, when I'm in university contexts, I get a lot of rotten tomatoes when I talk about this, because what I say is that we should be agnostic about the credential. What we should care about is whether or not it's high quality and whether it leads to further education and employment. That's what should matter the most. High quality should be defined that way, and we should be focused on the fact that in a system of post-secondary learning, an ecosystem, if you will, an array of credentials is really going to be that coin of the realm. Your currency in a labor market is going to increasingly be defined by your ability to demonstrate that A, you know something, and B, the credentials that you have actually signify that you know and can do certain things. And my view is that degrees will be one important element of that, but the monopoly of degrees as the pathway to the middle class and lifelong success is probably not going to be sustained. I think that we're already seeing employers recognizing new kinds of credentials. This happened 20 years ago when we saw the tech boom, and more employers were recognizing credentialing and certification systems that were very analogous from a compensation perspective to what you would get with bachelor's degrees or master's degrees. And now that we've had 2 decades of experience with that, we're seeing that in more and more other sectors. So my view is that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Degrees are really important. Many of you have degree programs as well as other types of credentialing systems that I think are really important. But degrees are not the be-all, end-all of the credentialing system. I think there's a lot of different ways to slice that rotten tomato going forward.
Hi, Jamie. Tom Carey again from the BC Association of Institutes and Universities. Thanks for your remarks and more for the great work that the Foundation does that we've all already benefited from.
Thank you.
In our panel session later today, we're looking at how a group of institutions like this could collectively work on those problems of preparing students for the future of work. We're using one example of a consortium from Europe, of Universities of Applied Science, but I'm wondering if there are American examples you could point us to where a group of a dozen institutions like this are working together to address what our students will need in the future, not just in the present.
Yeah, it's a fantastic model, and one that we are probably not as sophisticated as we should be as Americans with it. A part of it has to do with this, very rugged individualism American concept. We do it our way is the best way. Trust us, we know what we're doing. And actually, frankly, that model served American higher education for much of the 20th century. But I think with an economy where the demand for talent is rising, these collaborative approaches are going to be necessary. And we've started to see some inkling of that in some interesting ways. So you've probably read about this thing called the University Innovation Alliance, which is a really interesting effort involving research universities with places like Arizona State and Georgia State, Purdue University as anchors in it, where they're actually sort of shedding their competitive cloaks for the sake of accomplishing several things. One is achieving some of those equity goals that I talked about at the end of my comments. Another is to support innovation in delivery models so that they can go faster on the innovation front. They recognize that their ability to keep up with what others, the Southern New Hampshire universities, are doing is really stymied by the fact that they've been so inwardly focused in terms of their efforts for too long. And I think that's encouraging. And we've started to see other collaborative models now emerge, primarily in the university sector. There's a collaboration now of historically black colleges and universities, for example, that's doing similar work, and some other efforts. There is a preceding effort that Lumina Foundation was the anchor investor in for a number of years that has tried to do this with community colleges called Achieving the Dream. And Achieving the Dream has been a really interesting, successful collaboration of over 100 community colleges in the U.S. With a very simple, and some would say puzzling, a goal, which is to make community colleges to be about student success. Now you might ask yourselves the question, what the heck were they about before if they weren't about student success? And the answer is that the community college model in the U.S. really emerged in the 60s, not as primarily success-driven institutions, but as access-driven institutions. And my argument is access is one element of success, But if you create access without opportunities for students to actually complete the credential and make sure it's high quality, you've really actually potentially perpetuated a cruel hoax on them because you've given them hope and not given them the tools to actually succeed. So Achieving the Dream is another example of that, and I'm encouraged by that. But my sense is that what we've seen in many of the European nations, for example, and the example that you mentioned is a good one, are more sophisticated collaborative models. I started, before I came to Lumina, one of the things that I brought to Lumina was the conversation about the Bologna process, which when we first started talking about it in the US, people were running me out of the room talking about collaboration in Europe because they just couldn't understand how Americans could learn anything from the European experience. And I said, look at it this way. The Germans and the French have figured out how to collaborate better than Indiana and Illinois. I think we've got some work to do. And when you lay out the data to make that case, you suddenly realize there is a lot that you can do through collaboration. And I think that's terribly important to build on. Thank you. I'll just keep going.
All right, well, there's a total other topic I'll raise, and then I see if anybody else has some thoughts. When I was reading your book, and you were describing the federal structure that supports talent in the US, I know you were describing a very different country. We have our own ways in which we deliver education and higher education. But at one point, you talked about what effectively is a calcified way of delivering support to education. And you said, for every high-quality outcome we can point to equal efforts that have failed.
Right.
Uncertain outcomes of pilot projects, incomplete nature of policies, atomized. You talked about the Department of Education, the Department of Labor.
Right.
There's no relation, no organizing process, poor coordination, collaboration. We suffer from this here too.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
if we name that problem, and your vision was America needed a Department of Talent, how's that going?
Yeah.
How that even possible?
So when you write a book, it gives you an opportunity to put all your crazy ideas in one place. And so this is a crazy idea I had from many years in Washington, D.C. I spent over 2 decades of my life in Washington, D.C. And this dysfunction at the federal level is palpable. You can see it in so many different ways. The American and Canadian models are not really comparable here in that sense because the U.S. government does some things that the Canadian federal government does not. The provinces have a lot more authority in Canada than states do in a lot of ways. But I would argue that in our context, what was maddening was that what you had was these stovepipe parallel processes all being developed in different federal agencies, and they literally never talked to each other. And it was amazing to me, the best example, the one that I mentioned in the book, is that in the Department of Labor, you've got these employment and training programs, which are highly aligned with what we are or should be doing in most of higher education. But those programs not only don't talk to what's happening in the U.S. Department of Education, which has over $100 billion in resources to support higher education, primarily through student financial support. Not only did they not work with them, they didn't even care to understand them. They really weren't interested in working together. And during the Obama administration, the first part of the Obama administration, the ideal opportunity, it couldn't have gotten any better, was that the person in the Department of Labor who was leading the Employment and Training Administration was actually someone who was the Commissioner of Higher Education in New Jersey and who had previously been Senator Ted Kennedy's education advisor. She was not a labor workforce person. She was a higher ed person. So she was like the mole on the inside of the Department of Labor. She could not get the collaboration done. She couldn't accomplish it. And so my view was that we need to think about talent development and deployment at a federal level in a different way. I called it the U.S. Department of Talent. We actually used Photoshop and created a new building with the name on it. And what's interesting about the idea, when my book came out, I was very fortunate to get a lot of attention, but my favorite article about my own book, sorry for the self-reference, was in the Atlantic magazine because the headline was, "It's not a crazy idea." That was literally the headline of the article. And it was about the U.S. Department of Talent, which I think actually is a crazy idea. But the idea of actually collaborating at a federal level, I think is hugely important. We have not made a lot of progress in that conversation. Although interestingly, with a Republican Congress and a Republican president, your chances for talking about greater collaboration by improving efficiency, because my argument is that we don't need more government, we need better government, is an argument that resonates in a Republican administration. The problem is they have developed few signs of demonstrating that they are actually competent in managing government yet. And so they don't know what they're doing. Literally, they don't know what they're doing yet. They may actually get there at some point, but for now, they're not there. So the idea hasn't gotten a whole lot of airing so far.
Well, it's an interesting time we find ourselves in Canada right now because, as many of my colleagues know, and I know that there are so many colleagues here also from Ottawa, we have the federal government saying it needs a talent strategy for innovation. Its number one target is innovation. And the word talent is creeping into policy. So the way we see it is that in Canada is we need research talent because that'll cause innovation. So that is being managed by the industry department known as Innovation, Science and Economic Development. But across the river, there's a department called Employment Social Development Canada.
Right.
And it supports all that other stuff about student financial aid and apprenticeship, but they're not tied to the innovation agenda. And that is my own personal view that Canada needs a comprehensive, inclusive talent strategy. But so there are resonances in what you've been saying.
You know, this is, as Canadians, you're way more worldly than we are as Americans. So I would really encourage you to look at the models in other countries that have done this, right? So you see this in European countries. I saw this in my work in Africa where, out of necessity, they would create these collaborative entities, right? Science, technology, they'd bring all these things together, and they actually were essentially talent agencies in a lot of these countries. And I think there's something to be learned there.
Any other questions? No other questions?
Oh, wait, there is one more.
There's one.
We'll take one more.
Jake, come on up. No, that's okay, but you're giving the perfect setup to the panel that is about skills.
Okay, so a quick question from a technology perspective. I took a look at the website for your Credential Association, which looks like an amazing idea. Congratulations on pulling together all of those institutions already. But I didn't see anything around badging, and the reason I ask is because both in Europe with some of the initiatives that were mentioned earlier, but also I think online more generally, there's a movement towards open badges. I say this self-critically because I work for LinkedIn and we do not work properly with open badges.
Yep.
But I'm curious whether there is a potential link there.
Yeah, it is there. You're not seeing it because you're not seeing the transparent part of the website yet, but it is already there. And badging is a huge element of this. Lumina Foundation is an impact investor, so we not only invest in NGOs that are doing good work, but we actually invest in for-profit companies using our endowment resources. We have a large endowment that we can invest. And one of the companies that we've invested in is a company called Credly that is actually doing exactly what you're talking about. So we were one of the first investors in Credly, which I think is a really interesting idea. Someday LinkedIn may just buy Credly, but my view is that creating this platform for understanding and making sense of what is, I think, a wild west of the badging universe right now will be hugely important, and that will feed into the Credential Engine as we talked about. It's worth noting about Credential Engine that it is an open platform, and that was designed intentionally. So Credential Engine is a nonprofit organization. It is not a commercial enterprise, and our board of directors for the entity includes an amazingly diverse group of people. It is really uncommon to find an organization where you can find heads of leading companies and the secretary-treasurer of the biggest labor union in the country, the AFL-CIO, on the board of the same organization. But we've got that together with higher ed leaders because we see this as such an important collaborative effort. And back to your point, I think badges have an sort of untapped runway of potential that I don't think we're fully understanding. I'm learning this in a very concrete way with my own school-age kids and their experience with badging. And as learners, it is very real to them to earn these badges through these different technology-driven technology-mediated learning platforms that they're using, and I think there's an awful lot of potential there, so thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, yes, I see. That's great.
Thank you, Jamie. And maybe this is a perfect follow-on to that question, and that is the emergence of MOOCs, massively
Yeah.
open online courses. What's your opinion on the quality of the credentials that are or could emerge from that kind of a learning experience?
Right. So there's two versions of my book. There's the first edition and the second edition. And in the first edition, I spent quite a bit of time saying MOOCs were an interesting bump in the road of technology innovation. Because essentially what MOOC 1.0 was it was taking the existing learning materials and ideas and transmitting them using these massive open online approaches to large audiences of people. And we all sort of know what the hype was about. Suddenly, you gain access to learning material and resources from Harvard or MIT, and you're somebody in Kuala Lumpur, and isn't that exciting? But we also know a lot about the downside, which is that very few people actually completed the coursework, and few were able to apply them to actual credentialing systems because there wasn't a whole lot of uptake. But between the first and the second version, an interesting thing happened, which is that the MOOCs started to reinvent themselves to be more focused on these ideas around the connection to credentialing systems. And several of the MOOCs are now developing their own new credentialing systems. So it's not just a learning platform anymore, it's connected to learning systems. And the best example, one that ironically the Luna Foundation invested in, when MOOCs came along, when they were developed, Coursera, Udacity, edX, we said no to all of them because we didn't think they needed our money, and we were probably right about that in the 1.0 version. But we've invested in the MicroMasters program at edX because we see this idea of a micro degree program, a micro credential that is actually recognized by the faculty of MIT and Harvard as potentially game-changing. Think about this. So edX, which again is a collaborative between Harvard and MIT, got the faculty of both universities to say that the coursework that you do through in very specific fields like supply chain management, some other areas, that the coursework that you do through the MOOC platform of edX is fully applicable and transferable to the full master's program at MIT. In fact, if you complete the MicroMasters in certain areas at using edX, you are essentially one semester short of the full qualification for the master's degree from MIT. That's really interesting. And the question is whether or not they can scale that, which we'll find out here in the next few years. But so I was not very encouraged by MOOCs. I saw MOOCs as essentially a sort of analog to what the for-profits had been doing for a long time, which is using technology to put learning materials online in an innovative way. You know, granted, the label of the Stanfords and Harvards and MITs was interesting, but now I see this MOOC 2.0 evolution as potentially more interesting because there's a clear linkage to new kinds of credentials, which I think could be exciting.
I think we will because I know you have a tight schedule to get back on a flight to Minneapolis, is it?
Yes, Minneapolis to Indianapolis. I'm visiting all the Appleses today.
I'm going to let people have a chance to have a copy of the book from you.
Thank you.
And so it's my great pleasure on behalf of everyone here to thank you. Thank you for coming to NATE. Thank you for sharing your ideas. You inspire us, particularly those of us who want to talk about the public policy imperative behind the word talent. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jamie.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.